This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 18 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, May 6th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. The Board of Fire Engineers met at the Town Hall on Tuesday evening and organized for the ensuing year. Captain Sherman Fletcher was elected engineer, John Edwards clerk, and Alonzo Sutherland assistant engineer. The board voted to buy hose reels for the three companies and also made changes in the bylaws relative to the admission of members as follows. Quote, Article 7, Section 1. All proposals for membership must be made by the captain of the company to the Board of Engineers for their approval before becoming a member of the company. On the approval of the engineers, they may become a member by signing the roll of the company, end quote. The three companies were in each of the major villages of the town back in 1911. That would be Westford Center, Graniteville, and Ford's Village. Mr. and Mrs. Abile J. Abbott and Miss Alice Carnzu Abbott, their daughter, arrived home last week from a 3-month European trip. Miss Grace Lumbert has been spending a week with friends in Littleton. Mr. and Mrs. Wiley M. Wright were invited guests at the Grange Dramatics in Littleton last week, Friday evening, and Mrs. Henry Colburn attended them the previous evening, and all report a fine entertainment and a good time. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held their regular monthly meeting with drill and annual business meeting at the Hose House on Tuesday evening, May 2nd. Various hydrants at the west end of the village were opened and tested. The following officers were unanimously chosen to serve for the next year. J. Herbert Fletcher, Captain, Leonard Wheeler, First Lieutenant, Edward Abbott, Second Lieutenant, Aaron Tuttle, Treasurer, Peter Clement, Steward, J. Herbert Fletcher, Alec Fisher, and William L. Woods, Executive Committee. At the Congregational Church on Sunday, Reverend David Wallace preached most appropriately on, quote, the Bible, the great American book, end quote, as suggested by the 300th anniversary of the adoption of the King James Version. In the evening, reports were given of the Middlesex Union Association at Harvard by those who had attended. At the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, the following young people were voted upon to be received into the church on Sunday morning: Mrs. Ida Trask, Pauline Wallace, Sadie McMaster, and Otis Day. The J.C. Abbotts, I believe J.C. went by Jack, the Jack Abbotts enjoyed an over-Sunday trip to Maine in their touring car this last week. The ball game between the alumni and the academy team, played last Saturday afternoon at Whitney Park, resulted in a victory for the alumni team with a score of 17-1. The Westford team play the Littleton High School team this Saturday afternoon. Selectman Oscar R. Spaulding injured one of his hands with a sharp piece of wood while at work at his sawmill one day this week, causing a painful injury that required dressings by Dr. Wells. Aaron Tuttle and Miss Annie Blodgett were united in marriage on Wednesday of this week, May 3rd, 1911. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock and was performed by Reverend Benjamin Bailey. After a wedding trip, Mr. and Mrs. Tuttle will make their home at the Tuttle Homestead on Boston Road. Many good wishes attend the young couple from a wide circle of friends. About 20 from Westford attended Littleton Grange on Wednesday evening and enjoyed the good entertainment and supper in charge of the master and lecturer, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Barrows. Reverend and Mrs. David Wallace and Deacon and Mrs. Holton G. Osgood attended the Jubilee anniversary of the Ayer Congregational Church on Thursday. The next paragraph is on Memorial Day. The Veterans and Sons of Veterans met at Cavalry Association Building, which is the house now at 20 Boston Road, on Saturday evening and made plans for the time-honored observance of Memorial Day. Various committees were appointed as follows: the Honorable Herbert Fletcher and Captain Sherman Fletcher, Committee on Speaker and Entertainment. It was voted to provide dinner for veterans, sons of veterans, invited guests, and band. Committee appointed to extend invitations were sons of veterans Herbert Hildreth, Arthur Wilson, Ernest Dane, Elliot Humiston, Edward Hanley, Frank Hawks, Harry Nesmith, Warren Karkin, and Edward Riney. Dinner Committee: Mrs. Leonard Wheeler, Miss Agnes Balch, Mrs. Harry Nesmith, Mrs. Frank Miller, Mrs. Cyril Blaney, Miss Edith Bicknell, Mrs. Hannah Harrington, and Miss Mary Hanley. The Unitarian Society was appointed to decorate the Soldiers' Monument and grounds. It was voted to accept the invitation of Reverend Mr. Havermale to have the Union Memorial Service with the Graniteville Methodist Episcopal Church on Sunday, May 28th. The next couple paragraphs are about a concert. The concert by the Glee Club of Boston University, held at the Town Hall last Friday evening under the auspices of the Congregational Church, and which is the last in the season's social events that have taken place each month, proved most successful and enjoyable. There was a large and appreciative audience present, and the members of the club very appropriately responded with their best efforts, with the brightest and catchiest of songs, as well as those of more classical merit. Their action songs seemed to be particularly appreciated. One of their number was a reader and contributed a number of selections. Chorus, quartet solos, and readings were combined into an attractive and well-balanced program. Previous to the concert, the club was entertained with a supper provided in the church vestry. This was in charge of Mrs. Orion Wells and Mrs. Alfred Hartford, and the party gave their hostesses a rising vote of thanks for their hospitality. The 14 members were entertained for the night in various homes in the society. Notwithstanding that considerable financial risk was assumed in this enterprise, a good sum was turned into the church treasury. The committee in charge were Dr. and Mrs. Orion Wells, Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Hartford, and Harvard L. Wright. His nickname was Dick Wright. The next section is called Teachers Reappointed. The school committee held its regular meeting on Tuesday evening of this week. The list of teachers now serving our schools were reappointed for another year. The following new plan has been arranged for Superintendent Frank Hill, who will have an office in the Academy building after May 9th, where he may be found every Tuesday afternoon from 2:30 to 4:30 for consultation by parents and others on matters pertaining to the welfare of the schools. The room reserved for Mr. Hill is the trustees' room at the right of the entrance. Where the superintendent is a non-resident, this plan may prove helpful to those vitally interested in the schools. Tadmuck Club is the next section. At the special business meeting of the Tadmuck Club on Tuesday afternoon, various items of business were acted upon, among which were some changes in the Constitution, a change in the membership fee, and plans for the closing social. It was voted to change the annual membership fee from 50 cents to $1. It is most sincerely hoped that this will not deter any from a continuation of their membership. In the smaller beginnings of the club, the very nominal fee of 50 cents seemed adequate, but the executive board and others feel that the club can enlarge its scope and do better work and make the larger fee worthwhile to the members. It was voted to have a treasurer and secretary both, instead of having the office combined as formerly. The annual social has been postponed 1 week from the calendar date and will take place in a Unitarian church in the evening. Each member will be privileged to bring one guest. The plan of the committee is to make it a pleasant social event with pleasant environment and refreshments served at the close of the meeting. Seth Bannister, who has been laboring under the impediments of illness, is now answering recitation roll call again at Westford Academy. He was 18 years old at this time. Seth has the real student of essentials lurking about him that illness does not change. Mrs. Peck Wright, who has been ill, is several shades better than ill. Miss Elsie Coffin of South Berwick, Maine, is visiting her uncle and aunt, Charles E. and Miss Belle Walker, their brother and sister, not husband and wife, at their residence, the Walker, on Main Street. Miss Coffin is at present attending the Advent School at South Lancaster, where over 400 scholars tell what they know. Henry Keyes has bought a farm in Nashua and is making preparations to remove from the loved environments and lovely friendships of his native town. J. Willard Fletcher was overwhelmed in a surprise party on Tuesday evening. Representatives from Westford Center, Graniteville, and West Brookside came in unto him like a searching party for liquids, which they found. Also, breadstuffs and other sweet edibles, for which they returned thanks by way of song and games. Mrs. John Fletcher, as hostess, poured hospitably and nice ice cream all over everybody. This was no pink tea party, although everybody got a pink as a reciprocity balance. I presume that's a pink, the type of flower called a pink. Spring bonnets are out, and so are the strikes. The first in town in the strike line to get a move on was on Oak Hill. Among them, paving cutters, who deemed prices that concessions on the part of the proprietor thus far made have failed to touch. A liberal generosity on the part of the employer having been rejected, it has the appearance of a permanent disagreement for the season, and the large contract for New York City will be filled by changed plans. April showers make Mayflowers. Will someone with good eyesight tell us where they have been hiding this year? Showers and flowers. The Cold Spring Farm has caught the apple orchard epidemic and is setting a large acreage of trees on land bounded by the Providence and Lowell Road. The Brookside Mill management is improving low water opportunity beside mill repairs by removing long-standing dead trees and rubbish that impede water flow and soil flow, if you have that type of eyesight. CRP Decatur has received over 40 varieties of California roses and other beauty blooming bearing shrubs to adorn the lawn surroundings in the Stony Brook Valley. He lived on Lowell Road. These are the advanced thoughtfulness of his oldest daughter, Miss Alma, who's in California. The next section is the Forge Village section. A son, Fred P. Sanborn, was born on Friday, April 28th, to Mr. and Mrs. George, well, it says George A. here, but the birth record says George L. Sanborn. Mr. Douglas of Lowell, while engaged in overseeing work at the mill of Abbott and Company, met with a very painful injury on last week Thursday afternoon. He was attended by Dr. Sherman of Graniteville, who accompanied the injured man to Lowell in an automobile. The family of Amity Canton, it's spelled C-A-N-T-O-N in the Wardsman, but I believe the correct spelling is C-A-N-T-I-N. He is removed into their new home on Main, now East Prescott Street. Archie Bennett and Miss Beulah Batchelor of the Emerson School of Oratory, Boston, visited recently at the home of Alvin Bennett. Mrs. George Reed and son Randolph, accompanied by Mr. and Mrs. Goodchild, recently visited the home of Mrs. Mary I. Drake. Alice S. Bennett has gone to Worcester preparatory to a trip west. Miss Grace Lawrence and Miss Elizabeth Plummer spent Sunday in Lowell. Little Marguerite, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Daly, died on last Saturday, April 29, 1911, after an illness of 3 weeks, aged 16 months. She was born December 30th, 1909 in Westford. Burial took place on Sunday afternoon, and the interment was in St. Catherine's Cemetery. Services at St. Andrew's Mission were held at the usual hour, which I believe was 4 p.m., on Sunday afternoon. At the conclusion of the service, the young ladies who have been on probation were taken into the Girls Friendly Society, and each received the silver pen of the society. Reverend A.L. Bumpus officiated. Next Sunday morning, communion services will take place at 8:45. Mr. and Mrs. William Burnett returned on Sunday evening after a most enjoyable visit to Boston and Worcester. Reverend Michael E. Doherty of North Chelmsford conducted the Catholic services in Abbott Hall on last Sunday morning and delivered a most interesting sermon on, quote, the month of May, end quote. You may recall that the St. Catherine's Church was undergoing renovations, so they were meeting in Abbott Hall. A wedding in which many village people will be interested took place on Wednesday afternoon at the home of Reverend Benjamin Bailey in Westford, when Miss Annie Elizabeth Blodgett, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel L. Blodgett of Groton, became the bride of Aaron Tuttle of Westford. Miss Blodgett was attended by her sister, Miss Emma Blodgett, and Alfred Tuttle, brother of the groom, acted as best man. Mr. and Mrs. Tuttle will make their home in Westford with Mr. Tuttle's mother, Mrs. Nelson Tuttle. The regular meeting of Self-Help Lodge number 7026, Oddfellows, was held on Wednesday evening. Preparations are well underway for the concert and dance to be held by this lodge the last of the month, and promises to be novel in every respect. That's the news in Westford for the week ending May 6th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.